Our guest on Encounter is Ambassador Samuel W. Lewis. Ambassador Lewis, until his recent retirement, served 8 years as U.S. Ambassador to the State of Israel. He was appointed in 1977 by President Carter and attended the Camp David Accords. He was also kept on by President Reagan, so he has seen a great deal of activity and turmoil in the Middle East during his 8-year tenure. While he has retired from the Foreign Service, Ambassador Lewis by no means has severed connections with Israel. He is holding several appointments now. He is the first international fellow of the Dayan Center at Tel Aviv University. He is also board chairman of the Board of Overseers at the Truman Institute at the Hebrew University. He serves on the board of the Bank Leumi. He is diplomat in residence at Johns Hopkins University here in this country, and he is certainly well qualified to discuss Middle East issues. He is also writing a book to be published soon on his experiences in the Middle East. Hello, I'm Mike Leiderman. Ambassador Lewis joins us today on Encounter. Mr. Ambassador, after 8 years as the emissary to Israel, what is the strongest emotion that you come out of this job with? Start off right off.
Combination of a tiny bit of weariness and a great deal of nostalgia and regret that those 8 years weren't more productive, of more peace than they were.
Are you more fearful now for the Middle East situation than when you took the job in '77?
Well, I know a lot more about it now. I think I know a lot more about the dangers in the Middle East today than I did 8 years ago. So in that sense, yes, it's a terribly dangerous, violent region filled with so many hatreds and cross-currents that there's going to be bloodshed and tragedy continue for the foreseeable future. But I'm not at all pessimistic about the long term, if you can think of the long term as a decades or generations. I think that the years immediately ahead of us are going to continue to be violent years.
As we sit and talk this morning, emotions both on the Israeli side and the Arab side are running as high as they've ever run. We have the Achille Lauro situation. We have had several other bombings, terrorist attacks. There's a great deal of mistrust among the peoples. Do you see this being the darkness before the dawn, or might there not be any dawn?
I don't believe that we are smart enough to predict the future, except in the most general ways. I don't know what the solution is. I don't know how to bring peace to the Middle East. I don't think anybody does. I'm quite convinced that there are millions of people on both sides of the Arab-Jewish divide that desperately want to live with each other in peace. There is such an enormous suspicion of each other's motives and intentions that governments find it very hard to translate that inchoate desire of the peoples into reality. Every now and then, a leader comes along who can crystallize that deep sentiment of his people, as Anwar Sadat did when he came to Jerusalem in a toweringly courageous act. And he brought a certain dimension of peace to his people and, of course, with the help of President Carter and Prime Minister Begin, to Israel. Now, that was an important step, and I think it was a step that has changed the character of the Middle East irrevocably. You can never again go back to a situation where the Arabs can easily say Israel is a non-country, because the biggest Arab country, the most important one, made peace with it and recognized it. And although it's not the wholly satisfactory peace, it is peace. Now, when's the next step like that going to occur? I can't tell you. I think it's going to be a step when it occurs, not a total solution.
There was a time when Middle East leadership had a great deal of charisma. Israeli leaders such as Ben-Gurion, Golda Meir, Chaim Weizmann. On the Arab side, Sadat, for example, even Nasser. Now, there is not that charisma among the major Israeli or Egyptian leadership, Mubarak on the one side, Shamir and Peres on the other. Do you suppose it's going to take that kind of charisma to bridge this gap as opposed to managers who work out a solution?
Well, I think that's a very perceptive thought. You didn't mention, by the way, Assad or Hussein, who are two important actors. Sure. Of that group, I suppose Assad has the greatest charisma. And he's the least likely to make peace because at present, because Syria's own interests don't seem to lead him in that direction as he perceives it. But I think you're right. I think when the situation is so conflicted and the hatreds and the pain is so deep on both sides, that you get a breakthrough both when the peoples on both sides are weary and seeking something else, and that situation might well be true today. But that has to coincide with leaders not only who have charisma, and that means they have political clout and power with their own populations and can carry them to some great step or some great risk, but they also have to be extraordinarily courageous men or women. Now, Sadat, of course, was an extraordinary person. He not only had charisma, but he had extraordinary perception about the importance of the psychological factor in the debate. And when he said 70% of the problem is psychological, he was right. And he had the understanding to realize that to break that barrier and force the Israelis to come to him as well, he had to recognize them by going dramatically to their capital. That was a kind of genius stroke of insight into what was needed to break the impasse. I don't know that any of the current set of leaders on either side have that sort of flash of insight. Maybe they do. I don't know that because they're good managers mean they can't rise to the occasion. I hope it might. But I'll mention one other point. It's very easy to sit in the United States in what is a pretty safe society still and talk about Middle Eastern leaders not having enough charisma or courage to make great leaps for peace. After all, Arab leaders who are tempted to take risks, to stretch toward making peace, have to remember, undoubtedly do remember, what happened to all of those who have risked. There have been, let's say, 3 Arab leaders since 1948 who have been ready to sign peace treaties with Israel. One was King Abdullah. He was assassinated in Jerusalem. One was Amin Jamal in Lebanon, who remains in power, but only at the cost of repudiating everything he had signed and in a very precarious position. And the third was Sadat, who was assassinated, I think, not so much for the peace, but that was an element in the motivation of his assassins. Now, when you challenge King Hussein to be courageous and step forward, or some other leader, inevitably you have to think that they have their own survival interests to consider as well.
You mentioned Hussein. King Hussein has now said he will sit down and talk peace with Israel as long as there is some Palestinian representation. Well, where does Arafat fit in? What are your perceptions of Yasser Arafat?
Well, I think Arafat is the largest obstacle to negotiation in the Middle East. Why? Because he is in a position to veto or to blackmail the actions of the key actor on the Arab side who needs to come forward to make negotiations real at this time, King Hussein. Arafat has survived for decades by presiding over a broad, loose organization, which is partly a terrorist organization, partly a national resistance movement. Certainly it uses unacceptable, brutal means to carry out its objectives. And it does have a professed ideology of eliminating the state of Israel and replacing it with something else. Now, after that history, it's quite understandable why no Israeli government, I think today, whether Labor or Likud or both, can or will sit down and negotiate with the PLO unless the PLO changes so completely its character and its leadership as to be something different. There are temptations every now and then, certainly, and every time that Arafat goes through a period, as he has the last year, of talking about negotiating and seeming to step up to a peaceful track, he's also caught launching terrorist operations on the side, or his lieutenants are doing it. And the dual character of the organization becomes apparent, I think, to the world, as it has in this Achille Lauro affair.
You know the Israeli government, you know the personalities here, and you know what perceptions most Jews have of Arafat as nothing but a Hitler and a kafir. Where do you suppose there is room for some compromising or some concessions? Because, as we know, there has to be some compromises made.
Well, I think that in the long run, there is an insoluble issue here if you think about it in terms of dividing the land. After all, in 1948, the United Nations did pass a resolution which would have divided the land between a Jewish state and a Palestinian state. And it was the Arab governments around that immediately overran that Palestinian state. Jordan occupied the area that should have been the Palestinian state, and which Israel would have accepted at that point. I think that was the last time, incidentally, when a separate Palestinian state from Israel and Jordan was feasible. I don't think it's feasible today, and I don't think, quote, territorial compromise, dividing the small area of the West Bank again between Jordan or between Israel and Jordan or between Israel and a Palestinian state is feasible. May be morally a good idea. It's not politically feasible in this era or in the era to come. And I'm not sure it would be a good idea either, but I know it's not going to happen. Now, I think there is something that ultimately could provide sufficient sense of national identity for the Palestinians. It's a halfway house. It would be something analogous to the Benelux in the European context, where Jordan and Israel would share certain responsibilities over the land in between them for foreign policy and for defense, and where the area in between would have a great deal of autonomy, but would be tied economically and open economically to both sides, and would be insulated against the temptation of irredentism against the rest of Israel by the lack of an army or the lack of a separate sovereign statehood. I don't think a sovereign statehood can be managed or can ever be achieved today for the Palestinians. But I think a great deal of cultural and national autonomy and identity can be satisfied under an umbrella in which both Jordan and Israel share sovereign responsibility. Now, that's where you have to come out. How to get there from here, I can't map it for you.
It sounds wonderful on paper, but when you're talking about a Benelux analogy, you're talking about allies working together. Mm-hmm. Here you're talking about anything but allies.
That's right. Working together. That's right.
And yet you see that this might be feasible?
I didn't say it might be feasible today. I said it's the only way I can see that Arabs and Jews in that tiny area are going to find a way to live together. That's where they've got to aim for. And I think it is conceivably feasible when and if the PLO as an institution, as an organization which has a lot of its own built-in bureaucratic and personal career interests, begins to weaken or even disappears. That's why I say I think Arafat is the major roadblock on the way to peace. As long as he is there, he can stop any creative solution from being achieved.
He's also very much a media creation. Mm. He's very quotable.
Yes, he's very smart. He's clever. He's a slick operator, and he's got an amazing skill, a sixth sense at survival, and a great ability to convince people of his good faith and his honesty, even while misleading and betraying them. He's an artful actor on the world scene. There's no doubt about that.
Many people say what he's built is merely a house of cards with the illusion of control.
And part of it is that he has a lot of money, which he apparently has the sole keys to, which he's acquired over the years from contributions from Arab states and from investments of the Palestinian movement in legitimate businesses and maybe some less legitimate. But I'm told that his ability to maintain his own position over that organization, despite all of the splits and rivalries and hatreds within the Palestinian movement, relates in part to the fact that he's got the keys to the secret bank accounts, and therefore that's a lot of life insurance for himself.
Sure. This brings up a very important point. Arabs have poured billions of money into countries abroad and here in the United States. They've spent a lot of money in terms of developing corporations, businesses, academic institutions, and as we know, money talks. Is all this Arab money life-threatening to Israel?
Well, I think it was a little more threatening a few years ago than it is now. Seems to me that that danger, if there was a danger, peaked when the oil monopoly was at its height. What you have now developed as OPEC has become a weaker force and indeed unable to control either markets or production. You see these Arab states, all of them, hurting for money, interestingly enough, including Saudi Arabia, the richest. They don't like to spend their capital, for one thing, and the subsidies to organizations, good and bad, come much more, they're harder to get these days. I don't think this is a major threat, no. It's a problem, but I don't think it's a major threat.
You don't see buying ideology?
No, no. What you can buy is guns, you can buy assassins, you can buy to some extent the votes of small, weak countries in the United Nations. But none of those are fundamental threats. They're difficulties you deal with, but they're not going to threaten Israel's survival.
While we're dealing with life and death situations, a great deal of this revolves around public relations. And that certainly, from those of us who've been watching, has been one of the major failings of Israel lately. It seems as though Israel would always live on the basis of being David against Goliath, starting from 1948. And lately Israel is being portrayed, with the Lebanon incursion, with whatever else, as Goliath. It seems to me that this is a public relations problem that the Israeli government has to deal with. How do you see it?
Well, I think there's something to that. You can't easily be David when you become Goliath in military terms. That's one of their problems. It is true that the Israeli military institution today is very strong, and certainly in comparison with potential Arab adversaries, I would say stronger than it's ever been in its history. And we certainly get some credit for helping them to become so. But as a country and as a population, it's still David against well over 100 million Arabs and 4 million Jews or less. I don't think you can easily look like David if you are not David. That's the point. On the other hand, they could have done a great deal better over the last 8 years in their presentation of their views to the world. Prime Minister Begin had some special problems in this regard. He had a view of life and of his own convictions that made him feel really it was almost immoral not to say precisely with absolute clarity exactly what he felt at any point, whether it was diplomatically wise or not. He always insisted he had to cross the T's and make sure there was never the slightest misunderstanding. Now, I think that's been characteristic to some extent of other Likud leaders. The Labor Party, which has been dealing with the world for a whole generation, generally is a good deal more skillful at this. They can say no
and mean yes,
and make it sound very positive. Begin could say yes and make it sound very negative. So there's a certain personal style here. I think Prime Minister Peres is able to put in very moderate tones and very effectively, as he's been doing during his present visit to the United States, positions which, if they had been articulated by others, would have sounded much more negative. But there is a PR problem. It's not the center of the problem, but it's there, and it's something they ought to pay attention to, and some Israelis are very conscious of it. Others brush it aside.
As someone who is a disinterested party in all of this, if you will, what do you see as Israel's greatest strength, and what do you see as her greatest vulnerability?
Well, I think her greatest strength remains the strength that she's had from the beginning. It's the Israeli people. They are truly an extraordinary collection of tenacious, courageous, and creative people from 90 different countries around the world who've gone to make up that society. And that strength of the people is reinforced by their commitment to their nationhood. I mean, it's an old new nation, an old nation recreated in a new context. And I think the combination of the mix of ethnic groups that have gone to make up modern-day Israel and the determination to build and sustain the old new nation gives Israel a special kind of staying power. If you think about where they were 37 years ago when the state was founded and where they are today, it's a truly miraculous achievement, that state, despite having to fight 6 wars in 1 generation and absorb enormous number of immigrants and really operate on economic knife edge throughout those years. Now, the other major strength for Israel certainly is the friendship and support of the United States. I think there's no question that in this era of very expensive weapons and of diplomatic challenges and isolation, Israel needs a great power friend, and we are it, and I think we'll continue to be it. I'm convinced of that. The biggest danger or challenge for Israel is internal divisiveness. There is still, and probably will continue for a long time to come, an unresolved debate about the role of Orthodox religion in what is called the Jewish state. How much of a secular state, as the founders believed it would be, will it remain? That's a major problem for Israel in the next years. There certainly is a danger that the political vigor of that democratic system, which is extraordinarily democratic and extraordinarily vigorous, can lead to such excess in internal debate and struggle that the unity of the nation can be weakened against outside challenges. So I think those 2 issues are the major problem areas for Israel in the future.
Another red flag has been Israel's economy, with 4-digit inflation, spiraling costs. Do you see this becoming severe enough to eventually undermine the whole country?
I think they've finally managed to turn the corner on this in the last 3 months. Certainly the economy was being mismanaged badly for about 3 or 4 years, and the cost of that unnecessary and tragic Lebanon war added to the problem. The deficits were ballooning, money was being printed at very rapid rates, and inflation was spiraling out of control. A year ago it was upwards of 1,000% annually. But in the last 12 months, the National Unity Government has turned this around, and particularly since July, they really have set out on a very tough austerity program, which has already got inflation stopped, and I think has a good chance, if they can stick to it for a year or so, of getting the economy back on a growth path at moderate inflation levels. I'm quite optimistic in the long run about the Israeli economy. It's got a lot of creativity in its private sector in particular, and there's a lot of export potential now coming on stream. The problem has been very bad macroeconomic policies followed by governments, not because finance ministers didn't know how to manage, but because the political strife within the coalitions immobilized their best judgments and made them make decisions for political reasons, not economic ones. And now I think that road is now in the right direction.
Ambassador Lewis, earlier you lamented the fact that you didn't feel you made enough difference in the Middle East situation during your tenure, and yet you are maintaining your ties with Israel. Now, I understand while many people in high government office, from Vice President Agnew, for example, and several former senators, have maintained ties with the Arab states after their government service is over with for obvious benefit to them. What are you getting out of maintaining ties with Israel? What's in it for Samuel Lewis?
What's in it is that my wife and I have really become very much a part of that society, at least in our own minds. We see it almost as a second home for us now, and we expect to divide our time, at least for the next few years. We have more friends among Israelis, I think, than we do among Americans after 8 years out of the country, or as many. We like a place. We want to do something to continue to be associated with it.
You're going to live there?
No, I don't think we'll live there, but we'll live in Washington as we do now. But I've taken up a couple of academic appointments in Israel, as well as my major one in Washington at Johns Hopkins. And I'll be doing some work at Tel Aviv University and at Hebrew University as well. I'd like to try to help some Israeli philanthropic organizations that we've been associated with to try to get support in the United States. But basically, I don't think I'll ever have anything else to do with the diplomacy. I'm retired from the government. If I can give some advice or do some writing that will help a little bit, I'll certainly be doing it. Fundamentally, it's an emotional commitment. I like the place. I can't get it out of my system.
You worked in the Foreign Service throughout your life. What made this time in Israel so special for you?
Well, I suppose in part the fact that it's my only time as ambassador, but beyond that, it was an era in Israel and in the Middle East when we were dealing with some of the great problems of life, trying to make peace between age-old adversaries, and being a part of an effort to make peace does something for you. I was fortunate enough to be at Camp David and President Carter's team there, and I'm very proud of what the U.S. did to help that peace treaty with Egypt. I wanted to stay on and work on another one. That's partly why I stayed so long. We didn't make another one, but I found both the pain and the ecstasy of those years of trying to make peace, trying to stop wars once they started, and trying to sweep up after wars, in the Lebanon case, the most satisfying part of my life, without question.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ambassador.
Thank you, Mike.